Hey folks, Brian here with the Word Above All, and we are in Romans chapter 10 today, working our way steadily and slowly through the book. We're going to look at Romans 10 verses 1 to 4. Paul writes this, "Brethren, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them is for their salvation. For I testify about them that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. For not knowing about God's righteousness, and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." Now we can learn some really practical things from these verses. First one is, even though we know that God has chosen some people from the foundation of the world to be saved, we can still desire the salvation of all, and we can still pray for the salvation of all, because that's exactly what Paul is doing here. Remember, Paul knows, he wrote in chapter 9, verse 18, that God has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. That's 9:18. And later in verse 22, 23, he says that there are some who are vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, and there are others who are vessels of mercy, which God prepared beforehand for glory. So Paul understands that God is sovereign in the matter of salvation, and that it's ultimately his call and his decision. But that doesn't stop him from here in verse 1 from saying, "Brethren, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them," that is Israel, "is for their salvation." Well, he knows that not all Israel are descended from Israel. He knows that not everyone who is a descendant of Abraham is a true child of God, but he prays for their salvation and he desires their salvation. And I think that's a good example for us. We should desire and pray for the salvation of all people that we know of. Second lesson here, it is possible to be zealous for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. That's what Paul tells us was true about the Jewish people in Romans 10, verse 2. There are many false religions and false religious cults who are zealous for God, whether it's going door to door many hours a week to promote the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, or whether it is going on a 2-year mission to promote the Latter-day Saints, or whether it is praying 5 times a day toward Mecca, to Allah, or whether it is uprooting, leaving everything behind and moving to Ghana to promote the People's Temple. All of that is very zealous activity for their religious views. The problem is it's not according to knowledge. So there's much zeal associated with religion. The problem is there's not always a lot of biblical truth and correct knowledge associated with religious fervor and religious zeal. Third lesson, their lack of knowledge was in regards to the most important thing of all, how a person is made right with God. Because we're told here, let's go back up to the passage, not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, that is their own righteousness, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. So it's one thing to lack knowledge in secondary matters, but it's an entirely another thing and much more significant and impactful to not have correct knowledge in the most important thing, which is your own salvation. The Jews did not know about God's righteousness. They didn't know that God offered righteousness through the gift of Jesus Christ simply according to a person's faith. They didn't know that. And so they tried to establish their own righteousness. And so what they did is they tried to establish a righteousness which is of law keeping, obedience to the law of God. The problem, nobody can ever perfectly obey the law of God. And so nobody ever is declared righteous because of their obedience to law. The only way a person can ever be truly justified in the sight of God and be secure in that justified standing is when he puts his faith in Jesus Christ. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. And so, brothers and sisters, my friends, let us always trust in Christ alone for our righteousness, never in our personal obedience.